I facilitate some support groups and teach some classes. One of my areas of specialty is caregiving. So I've been at the Cancer Wellness Center actually for almost 25 years and wanted to give all of you an opportunity tonight to focus on you. I don't know all of you who are here in the audience, and then of course we're sharing this with others, but I know that I've got a nice bit of diversity, that I have some people in the audience who have a spouse with a cancer diagnosis, some with a parent who has a diagnosis, and some with an adult child with a diagnosis. So that is a nice bit of variety. And so when I'm talking about a caregiver, it can relate to any of you. So the reason we're doing this program is that caring for a loved one with a cancer diagnosis in particular can be a stressful experience. It can be isolating. And all too often, caregivers are forgotten by those who are concerned about the patient. So that is the healthcare team. Sometimes you have this healthcare team who amazingly and appropriately recognizes you when you're in the room and also asks how you're doing and do you have any questions. But all too often I hear from the caregiver, it's like I'm invisible. I'm not even there. The doctor doesn't even want to hear from me. So that's unfortunate and not the way that it should be ideally. Family and friends might be very concerned, understandably, about who has cancer, how they're doing, and they might forget to ask how you're doing. We at the Cancer Wellness Center look at cancer as a family illness. And what we mean by that is we recognize that everybody is impacted by this diagnosis. Everybody's lives change because of this diagnosis. And so we're here to talk a little bit about you. You might have some previous experience in caregiving that might help you out when you're in this new role. And you might be completely new to this. So maybe you were a parent. That is certainly a caregiving role. Maybe you cared for parents who were ill, elderly parents. Maybe you are in a profession like a nurse or something in the healthcare field where you are in a caregiving role. But it's different when you're caring for somebody who you love and who's sick and might not be able to provide all of the care they need for themselves. So we'll talk about different types of roles that caregivers might be in. So this might be new, even if you've had previous caregiving experience, but it can also be helpful to draw upon some of the previous caregiving experience that you've had. So there are obviously some practical task-oriented types of support that might be falling to you. You might be relied upon for emotional support. You might be an advocate for the person who has a diagnosis, advocate with the healthcare team. Maybe you're a researcher, somebody who likes to do some research about what is this particular chemotherapy drug? What are the side effects to be expected? What can I do about those? Are there any clinical trials? But it's hard to be all of those things, to fill all of those roles. And so sometimes relying on the support of others can be helpful too. So communicating and negotiating to clarify what the roles are. First and foremost, that will ideally happen with the person who has the diagnosis. What kind of support do they need and how do they want to be supported? So maybe they don't need actual physical support, but are looking more for and needing the emotional support. Maybe it's picking up some of the roles around the house that they used to do. So there might be a shift in roles. And again, advocate, researcher, so all different kinds of roles that you might find yourself in. But you'll hear me mention communicate and talk about so often because we can speculate all kinds of things, but unless we ask, we're kind of guessing. We're just assuming at what maybe they want us to be doing for them, or we might be putting ourselves in a position of what we think we'd want if we were the cancer patient. So think about and talk about what is the patient able to still do for themselves, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And what do they now need from you or others? You know, also keeping in mind that you might not be able to do all of the things that are needed. So there might be the need to bring in some additional support. This will certainly change from when the patient is newly diagnosed throughout treatment. Every diagnosis, every patient, every treatment is different. So it might change if your patient, your loved one, needs surgery, chemo, radiation, the kind of support they need, if there's practical support or even emotional support, might shift. So these are ongoing conversations about what kind of role are you expected to be in. What was your relationship prior to the diagnosis? What were everybody's roles in that relationship? Are you caring for somebody that you live with, or somebody who's long distance, or somebody who lives in another home? And were there tensions, challenges in that relationship? Those all need to be explored, examined, ideally discussed, and really reminding yourself. I think I mentioned in a later slide that so often when there's a diagnosis or something serious happens, we hope for or wish for or even expect this, what we call a hallmark moment, that things will be, everybody will come together, everybody will be available to support one another. And that's just often not the case, unfortunately, that whatever tensions or challenges were there in a relationship before, not only will likely continue to be there, but might be exacerbated. If this was a loving, supportive relationship, that will help coming into this. But that doesn't mean there won't be tensions and challenges. So just really being honest with yourself about what was the relationship before and what's realistic to expect now that I am in this role. And again, conversation about that or seeking support around that can be helpful. Are there any taboo topics, things that that the caregiver doesn't want to talk about, that you might not want to talk about? So that usually comes up in this desire to protect the people that we love. So when we're overwhelmed, when we're frightened, when we're angry, when we're feeling something that some people call a negative emotion, I tend to call it more an uncomfortable emotion, because all of those emotions are real. The negative piece is just that they're hard and they might bring up some challenges in how to express them in a way that's appropriate, healthy, comfortable. So is there a tendency to protect each other from some of those difficult topics, and how can you get some help and support in communicating some of those things? I mentioned already that the roles are likely to change as you go through treatment. So doing all of this on your own can be really challenging, if not impossible. So who can be brought in as part of your support system? There are the obvious friends, family members, members of the healthcare team are even part of the support team. Is there a phone number you can call? Often your oncologist has a nurse who's your point person. Neighbors, do you join a support group? Do you have a therapist? Clergy? It's not an extensive list that I put up there. And all of these people are not there just to support the patient, but also to support you. Again, conversation with the person who has cancer. What kind of support are they willing to accept from other people? Sometimes you run into the challenge of, I don't want everybody to know my business. I don't want everybody to know, or anybody to know, I have a cancer diagnosis. So that can be hard for the caregiver if the person with cancer wants to be more private and the caregiver needs some support for themselves. So how to navigate that? Again, lots of conversation around that. And sometimes even a reality of, you might not need or want that, but I'm in this too, and I also need some support. So how can we respect each other's boundaries and each other's needs and come to some compromises about where I can get support? And can the patient recognize that you also need support? We do hear sometimes that some patients say, I don't know what kind of support you need. You're not the one with the diagnosis, but think back to what I said earlier. Cancer is a family illness. You might not have the diagnosis, but you are definitely impacted by this diagnosis. And in some situations, it can be emotionally even more challenging for the caregivers than for the patients. And we can certainly talk about that more later if that's something that seems confusing. It can be hard to ask for help. It can be hard to not want to do everything for the person that you love. But if you do have other people who are willing to and wanting to help, it can be helpful if you remind yourself that you really are giving a gift to other people by allowing them to help. That most people who offer to help truly want to. They feel helpless, they are feeling lost, they're also concerned, and they want to be able to do something. So really, when people offer help, most often they mean it. Not everybody's good at everything. So I mentioned all of those different caregiver roles before. So when you're assigning tasks to your support team, be realistic about the skill sets of your support people. Some people will be there to listen, to be your sounding board, to let you cry on their shoulder, to share the good times, anything you need to talk about, but tasks, not so much. Others, don't talk to me about the emotions. Please don't cry. I can't handle that. That'll make me run away, but I can mow your lawn and I can do drives to and from chemo, and I can make meals. Some people are great coordinators, and maybe they're the person you put in charge of coordinating the meal train or coordinating all of your helpers with the tasks. So talking to people about what they're able to do, or if they're people you know well, you kind of know what you can ask of them and what tasks they can be assigned. Depending how long you've been in this, some of you might have experienced this already, that people will surprise you. Sometimes in really fabulous, wonderful ways. People that you never expected to show up will be there, maybe past coworkers or neighbors that you didn't know so well, but they are compassionate, understanding, caring people, or they want to help make your yard look nice. And I talked to somebody recently who friends were coming over to put up Christmas decorations because they have little kids at home and mom and dad just aren't able to do that this year. So people can show up in some really lovely, unexpected ways. And then you can sadly be disappointed by people that you thought would be there for you who really, for whatever reason, don't show up. Maybe it's just emotionally too much for them. They're too uncomfortable. They have no idea what to do. They feel incompetent. Whatever it is, they can't be there for you. So if at all possible, if you can have some compassion for them and understanding and kind of let that go, or maybe it's something you need to talk through in your therapy sessions, because it can be painful and sad for you to not have those people around when you expect them to be. A difficult question a lot of people get is, what can I do to help? And when you're already overwhelmed, that can be a tough question to ask. So I recommend that people keep a list of, take a look at my list and pick something. Or, well, right now I need somebody to pick the kids up from school on Wednesdays and get them to soccer practice. Or we could really use meals on chemo days. So if you have a list, it's much easier to go to that. Again, it can also be helpful to have a coordinator, somebody else who answers that. Like, oh, you want to help? Great. Can I give your name and number and email address to Carol, because she is organizing all of my helpers for me. There's a great website called Lots of Helping Hands. So if you have that need to coordinate meals, visits, rides, anything, that's a really lovely resource. And there are other resources like that, but thought I'd mention that tool. Self-care. So you've probably everybody's heard the analogy of the airplane. You need to put your oxygen mask on first before you can take care of anybody else. One of my coworkers just did a program earlier this week titled "You Can't Drink from an Empty Cup." So taking care of yourself when you're a caregiver can be challenging for all kinds of reasons. But it really is important to remember that your goal is to be the best caregiver possible, and you cannot do that when you are depleted. So paying attention to how do you take care of yourself? Are you eating healthy? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you getting your exercise? Are you getting breaks, downtime? Are there other people who can come in if your person with cancer really needs somebody with them 24/7? Who else can do some of that? When you do have a break and you go out to coffee or you're on the phone with a friend, clarify what is helpful. Do you need to talk about what you're going through? Is that why you called, or is that what you need from them? Or do you want a distraction? Sometimes people don't know what to say or do, and so they really appreciate if you can give them some direction. So it might be that I know a lot of people will avoid telling a caregiver or somebody with cancer all the good things that are going on in their life because they feel bad doing that. So you might need to say, hey, I want to hear what's happening with your job promotion or the trip you just went on or with your kids. I want to know there are good things happening and I care about you. And so I still want to be involved in your life and know what's going on. Or maybe you don't. and then you don't have to offer that that's what you want. But you need to be clear about what is helpful for you in those conversations so that you are getting what you need. And that's part of your self-care. So often, I mentioned before about the challenging emotions. So often it's just human nature. We want to kind of push down and avoid some of those more challenging emotions, like when we're sad, when we're frightened, when we're anxious, when we're angry. We don't know what to do with those emotions. But if we are constantly pushing them down, they're going to come out sideways. Irritability, depression, tension, road rage. So to avoid that, you really need to figure out, how do I work this through? How do I acknowledge what I'm feeling? How do I let myself feel that in a way that's healthy, constructive, or at least gets it out? For some people, therapy, I've mentioned a few times, journaling, talking with a friend, letting yourself cry. These things can even be with the patient, but that depends on the patient. I mentioned before the taboo topics. Can you do this with the person who has cancer, or are you trying to protect each other from those things? There isn't necessarily a right or wrong with that. And actually I've got this later, but I'll just touch on it quickly. Some patients really don't want you to cry in front of them. They want you to be their cheerleader, and others are upset that the people that love them never cry with them. Like, do they not feel sad? Am I not supposed to cry in front of them? So again, talk about it, figure out what you need from each other. But for you, finding a way to express all of your emotions will allow you to feel more optimistic, hopeful, to feel more joy when that comes your way. If you're stuffing down all these other emotions, that gets in the way of the joy and the optimism and the hope. Thinking through and brainstorming and coming up with activities of really what feeds your soul. What did you used to enjoy that you still can enjoy? Going for a walk, even if it's just around the block, being in nature. Friends, family, if you have grandchildren, I so often hear that's a bright spot. Music, reading, art. I just put a few different things down, some kind of a creative outlet. So you may not have a lot of time for that. And maybe some days you have 3-hour break where you can do that. And some days you have 10 minutes, but something each day that really is for you. Guilt can be a big thing. Well, how can I do that when the person I love can't do that? And that isn't always the case. It might be the person with cancer is still able to golf and go to the card game and, do all of their things, but sometimes not. Maybe they can't leave the house and you feel guilty about doing that. But reminding yourself, if you don't do these things for you, you are not going to be able to be the best caregiver possible. You are not going to be there for them. You're going to be depleted. Next point there is that completely selfless devotion can lead to burnout on your part, insomnia, depression, increase in anxiety. So all kinds of challenges that will negatively impact your ability to be a good caregiver. You might have a patient who resents that you go out, that you get to do these things for yourself. I don't find that that is the norm. The norm is more that the person with cancer recognizes that this is a challenge for you, and they are happy for you to go out and take care of yourself. But again, there's no one situation. That is another ongoing conversation with the person who has the diagnosis. Lots of studies have been done that demonstrate that your mental health, your physical health correlates with your ability to caregive, and then impacts the well-being of the person with the diagnosis. So taking care of you is part of taking care of them. Maintaining intimacy. So that's not just sexual intimacy. There's lots of types of intimacy. Communication, once again, no surprise, is what I'm advocating most. Really intimate relationships are relationships where you feel trust, you feel safe, you can be vulnerable with each other, you respect each other's boundaries, you have respectful interactions, you feel appreciated, you express appreciation. And then the different kinds of emotional or of intimacy. There's emotional intimacy where you can be honest with each other in your conversations. You can be transparent about what you feel, about the fears that you have, about the thoughts that you have, about the hopes that you have. And you can also hear that from them. So that's emotional intimacy. So I talked before about those taboo topics. If there are those topics, if you're working hard to protect one another, it can rob you of that opportunity to really have that emotional intimacy and continue to support each other. Mental intimacy, that's intellectual intimacy, sharing ideas, talking about things that you would have talked about before the diagnosis, because life can kind of be consumed by this diagnosis. It's very normal for the cancer patient to become very self-consumed. That's just normal when somebody has a serious illness. And think about if you have the flu or if you've had COVID while you're feeling miserable, it's pretty hard to see outside of yourself. And it is important and helpful to help draw that patient outside of themselves, and to have that gives you an opportunity to continue to connect with them. Spiritual intimacy, so that is not only about spirituality, and it can be about faith if you are a person of faith, but also just feeling close to that person, feeling validated, feeling safe, again, sharing some of your innermost values, your belief about the purpose of life, your ideas. So a lot of these are similar. I see that spiritual intimacy being very closely connected to emotional intimacy. And then there's physical intimacy. And this isn't just with your partner. This is true of anybody that you're caring for. But again, respecting boundaries. So just a cuddle or a hug, holding hands, foot rub, massage, just different ways that physical human touch is still really important. And then, of course, there is sexual intimacy, which may or may not be possible during cancer treatment. So talk about it, communication again, to maintain that intimacy, but there might need to be accommodations made. Is there pain? Is there fatigue? Is there dryness? All kinds of issues that might also need some conversations with the healthcare team about interventions or supportive suggestions. So keeping that intimacy in the relationship is important. If you are a spouse, that's a way to feel less like a parent of your spouse, less like a roommate of your spouse, and more still like a partner of your spouse. Finding gratitude. So sometimes I hear, well, what is there to be grateful for? And depending where you're at in the trajectory of the diagnosis, that can be a little bit more challenging, but usually people are able to find, if they stop and think about it, things that they're grateful for. The reason I have this here is if you can slow down sometimes and pay attention to what still gives your life meaning. What are you grateful for, whether in your relationship with the person that you're caring for, in your life, in the lives of the people that you love, that can help also to decrease some of the depression, the anxiety, the fear, some of those more challenging emotions. This next bullet point is just what I talked about before, that really it's important to allow ourselves to experience and express all of our emotions. Sometimes people say, I can't cry. If I start crying, I'll never stop. Obviously not true. You'll exhaust yourself and you'll eventually stop. And it can be cathartic and helpful to get that out every once in a while. Anger, ideally, do not take that out on the person that you love, and hopefully they won't. But that is one thing that can happen all too often, that when there's anger, when there's irritability and it gets shoved down, then you as the caregiver might feel like every time that person with cancer is angry or irritable, I am the one that gets the brunt of that. And that isn't okay. So talking about that and letting them know that's not okay and helping them find some other outlets, just like hopefully you do for yourself, so that you don't take out that irritability on them, because that builds resentment and gets in the way of that intimacy if you're just under each other's skin all the time. Thinking about how you define being a successful caregiver. What does that mean for you? So often people have the goal of just being the best caregiver they can be. And sometimes there's gratitude to be able to do that, to care for this person that you love. Meaning making is something that is human nature. It's something that we do. We try to make sense of things. And in difficult situations, it can be really helpful if you are able to do that. Sometimes that's some work you do in therapy. Sometimes with journaling, you can figure out some of what does this mean. I steer people away from making meaning for somebody else. So you might have had people who say things and they're well-meaning about why this is happening or what this should mean to you. That doesn't tend to sit well with anybody. So beware of doing that to others. And if people are doing that to you in the kindest way possible, if you can let them know when and why that's not helpful. It can come across as judgmental. It really, meaning making is something you have to figure out for yourself. So it can also be about the sense of purpose that you feel in being a caregiver, your spirituality, and that can be religious or not, just however you define spirituality can help it with meaning making. I see a lot of this as that connectedness piece, being in the moment, connectedness to the moment, being connected to yourself, really being aware of how you're feeling, what you're thinking, how you're responding to this situation, feeling connected to the others who are in this situation, not only the person with the diagnosis, but people in your inner circle, especially your family, your closest support system. For some people, a connectedness to nature or to something that they consider significant or sacred. And allowing, this goes back again to that gift that you give not only to other people in your support system, but really to you and to the patient, that when you allow others to be a part of your support team, you let the caregiver, you let yourself and the patient recognize that you're valued and loved. People really do want to be there for you. And that is also something for which you can feel grateful. So, few questions that came from all of you. Thank you for giving that some thought. So I gave a little thought to my responses here. Somebody asked, what are ways to let the person that we're caring for still feel independent and not feel like a burden? I could have started every one of my bullet points, as you're realizing right now, with communicate. You have to talk about it. What are they able to do for themselves? What do they want to do for themselves? And then let them do that. Sometimes caregivers fall into this, oh, no, you sit, oh, you rest, I'll get that for you. That's not doing them any favors. If they are able to get themselves that glass of water, it's good for them to get up out of that seat and get to the sink and get that water and come back. But maybe they can't, right? And so on the other hand, sometimes I hear from caregivers, all they do is sit in the chair and I have to run around and do everything. So talk about that. What are they feeling? It's hard for us to really know that. And so a lot of it is trusting what they're saying. If they are saying, I am just too tired to do this, they are telling the truth. Cancer fatigue is something like we don't experience just because we didn't get a good night's sleep. Now, if we don't get a good night's sleep, that is real fatigue. That's exhausting. But cancer fatigue, first I'll say fatigue is the biggest side effect of having cancer, of surgery, of chemo, and of radiation. And it's a kind of fatigue that we don't generally experience unless we're going through something like that, where people describe, I brush my teeth and then I have to lay down for another half hour to recover from that. Getting dressed just completely wears me out. I can't climb up and down the stairs all day because if I do that, I'm going to need a nap if I just go up the stairs. So really communicating with them to understand what is their level of fatigue. And that, again, will vary. During their chemo cycle, it varies. After they recover from surgery. So talking about it and really understanding what can they do for themselves and what do they want to do, and really let them do that. Let them be as independent as possible. Where can they help out around the house? And not just having one thing that changes and then you stick with that, but this is continually checking in. Like you'll start to notice patterns with chemo that maybe on days 1 through 3 post-treatment, or maybe the first day when they're on all the steroids, they can do all kinds of things. That's when they do the laundry and you let them clean the bathrooms. Great. But maybe days 2 and 3, they're completely wiped out and they can't do that. So figuring out how they can help so it doesn't feel like it's all on you, if that's something that they're able to do, or again, do you have to bring in other support people? Are they able to continue to work? That gives them a sense of purpose and independence, and what modifications do they make there? So all of this is constantly shifting, changing. There's that need, as I said, to constantly be talking about it and checking in, but doing that in a way that doesn't feel like you're bugging them. Sometimes the patient gets annoyed, like, you're always hovering over me. You're always asking how I'm doing. You're always asking how I'm feeling. So even having conversations about those conversations, it's the meta communication, talking about talking. How often do you want me to check in? What if I don't check in? Can I trust that you will just tell me without me checking in? I'm checking in because if I don't check in, I don't know. So how can I know that you're going to tell me how you're feeling and what you need from me? And then some of the biggest challenges that I find, particularly when I'm working with couples, is conversations, which become more than conversations, arguments about eating, drinking water, and exercising. You're not eating enough. The doctor said you need to stay hydrated. Do you really want to end up back in the hospital? You can't keep losing weight, like things that start to come across as nagging. Why are you sitting? You know that the doctor said you need to get up and move around. And then the patient saying, I'm eating as much as I can. I'll move when I can move. So how to table some of those conversations and get back to trusting the patient and letting them know that you're concerned about them, and that you want to support them and you want to make it possible and more likely that they'll do these things when they're able to. So with meals, how much to put on their plate. Sometimes they get a full plate in front of them and just looking at that or smelling hot food makes them too full. So maybe smaller portions of cold food. Maybe just keeping water there for them and they'll drink it, or they can't drink water because of the taste. So maybe lemonade, or figuring that out. Or you get annoyed because yesterday they wanted lemonade and you went to get it, and by the time you got back, the lemonade didn't taste so good to them anymore. So just, as much as possible, taking those frustrations out somewhere else rather than on the patient. And it's not because you don't care, it's because you are really concerned and frightened that if they're not eating enough or drinking enough or exercising enough, they're going to decline. But how to have those conversations respectfully without nagging, and letting them in those areas too be as independent as possible. And then really being a team member when problem solving, not coming in and being the fixer. So that's one thing in a total generalized stereotype that we know that men like to fix things. There are plenty of women who like to fix things too. And so but you can really feel like you're not heard when the caregiver just wants to come in and fix things for you. So really back to that communication, and how can you be a problem solver who really listens to and trusts the patient? All of that gets back to letting them be as independent as possible. Another question: what if my loved one doesn't want to seek outside emotional support? How do I help them? So very often we see caregivers here at the Cancer Wellness Center and never see the person that they're caring for, either because they're not physically able to be here, although that now that we have this virtual opportunity and Zoom sessions, that takes some of that barrier away. But sometimes they just don't want to. They don't have that interest. They don't want to be in a support group. They don't want counseling, but you can still access all of that. So what do you do about that? How do you help them if it feels like this need to support them emotionally is all on you and they're not getting some outside support? Can you enlist the help of any family members or close friends that they'll confide in? That might be one option. Will they have some conversations with you? I've talked a couple times before about that, those taboo topics or tendency to protect each other. But if they're not having an outlet somewhere else, it might be even more important to have some of those conversations with you. Looking for conversation openers. It's very easy when they say something that feels uncomfortable to shut them down. And in a well-meaning, it's because you are uncomfortable or you're trying to take care of them or protect them or want them to stay hopeful and you're uncomfortable with the topic. It might be, I've been thinking about where I want to be buried. Oh, we don't need to talk about that. Or that's not going to happen. The doctor said you're going to be okay, right? So that might be an opener, or it might not even be quite as blatant as that. It might be just making a comment on something somebody else said or something that came up in a television show you were watching. And so rather than shutting it down with, no, you're going to be okay, using that opportunity to start a conversation. Is that something that you want to talk about? Or have you given that some thought for yourself? Or if they bring it up, talking about your thoughts, your wishes, even for yourself. It doesn't have to be just about them. I mentioned meta communication before, talking about what you talk about, talking about communication. It might be, I've been wanting to talk to you about, we need to get our wills together, or I don't even know if you want to be buried or cremated, or you keep alluding to not wanting to do treatment anymore. And I've been pushing that off because I really want you to keep trying. But I think these are important things for us to talk about. So it might be just acknowledging how hard it is for you to talk about something. If you want to talk about something and you're not sure they do, then preface it with, is this a good time to talk about this? So respect that they might need to kind of work up the physical and or emotional energy to have some tough conversations. So let me know when it's a good time before you just say, hey, right now we're going to talk about this. That might not go over well, and you might not have the quality of conversation that you'd like. We do offer couples counseling here, and it really is all focused primarily around the cancer diagnosis. So sometimes it just needs a few sessions to help bring up some tough topics that you can continue to talk about on your own, or to figure out how do we best support one another? How do we talk to our kids about what's going on? All kinds of topics that we can address if you want to come here and have us help facilitate some of those conversations. Now, you might, this came from how do I help somebody who won't seek emotional support? I bring that up in this slide because sometimes it's more comfortable for them if you are there with them. So they might be open to couples counseling, but sometimes still not. No way, no how, not going to do it. And you can't change that. You can offer it, you can suggest, you can go yourself and let them know how it's helpful to you, but there's no guarantee that they will ever take advantage of those resources. Do you have any tips for handling the holidays? I want to make the winter holidays special for my family, especially in case it's the last one we're all together. I think the person added at the end, Thanksgiving was really hard. So what I will say first is that can be a lot of pressure on you. So if this is how you're feeling, ideally, please don't take on this expectation alone. Talk about it. I think I might have put talk about it or conversation or communication in the first bullet point of every slide. I am a therapist. It's just where I go. So if this is a secret mission that you're trying to do on your own, you are probably going to be disappointed because you're going to have some expectations and it's just not going to go the way you want. So hopefully it's something that you can be honest about, that you're really feeling this pressure and this need to make this special, and how can we do that? So if there are young children or adult children or other family, and ideally, hopefully the person who has the diagnosis, if there can be conversation around this, that's the ideal. What's realistic? Back to what we talked about before. How much energy do they have for activities, even for other people visiting? How much are they awake or up or about, or can get out during each day? Is there treatment happening during the holidays? So just be realistic. And then who's all involved here? And how are they managing and navigating this? Everybody's got their own personality they bring into this, all of their emotions. So, those are all things to be realistic about so that you don't end up disappointed. I mentioned already to beware of the expectations and hopes for those hallmark moments. Sometimes that'll happen, but if we have that expectation, we can be disappointed. And then sometimes it's just about what are the family traditions that you've already had? Can you continue those? Because that is comforting to people. That feels nice. Family stories, that can be in the form of telling stories, but it can be facilitated by home movies, photo albums, some legacy, talking about grandparents maybe who aren't here anymore or other family members. Are there any legacy interests or projects that appeal to the person who has the diagnosis? Are there ways in which they want to be remembered? Are there projects that they want done? Do they want some videos done? Do they want a family photo at the holidays? Or are they saying, no, not going to be any photos this year? So there can be some conversation around those kinds of possibilities. I love StoryCorps. If you're not familiar with it, if you listen to NPR, you might have heard like these 2.5 to 3 minute little snippets from StoryCorps conversations. But they have a website and they have this fabulous app. And you can go on that app and get all kinds of suggestions for having a conversation or an interview with somebody that you love. And it can be about, hey, Mom, I would really love to have your voice recorded talking to us about, you pick the topics, right? Or if there's something that, Mom really wants to discuss about her childhood or her growing up or her memories of you as a child. So I would suggest, if that appeals to you at all and might appeal to the person who has the diagnosis, if they're willing to have a conversation, it doesn't have to be all just you asking them questions. It can be conversational, but on the website and on the app, they've got all kinds of great suggestions for questions and conversation starters and tips for how to get the best quality recording. And those recordings can be kept for you on the app. StoryCorps also, if you want, you have to give them permission for this. They archive their stories that are recorded in the National Archive. So they've got thousands of stories that they've recorded from their different story booths that they have at different places around the country. So I think that is just a really great way to save voice recording and lots of just fabulous information. And then the last question, I'm looking for a caregiver support group that meets regularly. Where can I find an independent, comprehensive list with descriptions of all groups available in person and online? When you find that, let me know. but I have some resources. So at the Cancer Wellness Center, we have support groups for you. There's a Tuesday 90-minute support group, meets every week. It's virtual. It is, those first two groups I mentioned are primarily spouses and partners with a cancer diagnosis, but not exclusively. So in each of those groups, the Tuesday and Wednesday group, there's at least one person who has an adult child with a diagnosis. Sometimes there are adults, so everybody in there is caring for an adult. Nobody's caring for a minor. But so there can be other family relationships in there, like an adult caring for a sibling or for a parent. But we also have a separate adult child caregiver if you're an adult and have a parent with a cancer diagnosis. So those groups meet weekly. They are virtual. They are committed groups, not drop-in groups. So you commit to being there. Certainly, obviously, sometimes things come up, but that way you really get to know the other people in the group and get and give support. You can also access counseling, individual counseling, family counseling, couples counseling at the Cancer Wellness Center, wellness programming, yoga classes, stress reduction classes, exercise, and then different educational programs like this one. Those are all available to you as the caregivers as well. All of our services are free of charge. Call that phone number for a quick intake if you're interested in any of those services. Cancercare.org has some great online, still professionally facilitated support groups. Family Service of Lake County is a gem that is unfortunately not well known. They have a caregiver section where they have an in-person support group. It's at one of the area senior centers. They offer counseling, some pro bono legal services, with help putting together wills, things like that. If you need respite care, they've got some grant money to help you access some of that. So a great resource if you check out their website. There are other organizations like ours. Cancer Support Center is in southern suburbs, Gilda's Club in the city, Wellness House in the western suburbs. And so, you can also access their services virtually. If you or family members live closer to those areas, that's good to know about. Also, some hospitals have support groups. They tend to have more networking, information sharing groups that might be cancer specific. Senior centers, your church, your synagogue. So there are other resources. Cancer.org is the American Cancer Society, and they have some great caregiver tips, resources, things you can read about on their caregiver page. And then lots of cancer specific sites like American Brain Tumor Association, Leukemia Lymphoma Society have caregiver resources. So I told Mary, I think that I'd probably talk for 20 minutes and then we could open it up to Q&A, but as usual, that was 50 minutes. So I'm going to have Mary